Welcome to the third session of our 2022-2023 Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group. This year's talks centers around the theme Legacies of Injustice. The theme encompasses a broad range of injustices in both the past and the present, which are connected to a complex web of colonial issues. Without further delay, we would like to warmly welcome our today's speaker, Dr. Ayesha Fuentes. Dr. Ayesha Fuentes is an objects conservator and technical historian specializing in material religion and the care and custodianship of archaeological and anthropology collections. She completed her formal conservation training at the UCLA Getty MA program in the conservation of material heritage. She also has a PhD from SOAS University of London, where she wrote her dissertation on the use of human remains in Tibetan ritual objects. Dr. Fuentes is currently the Isaac Newton Trust Research Associate in Conservation at the University of Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Ayesha's topic today will be documenting time and the legacies of displacement at the University of Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Welcome, Ayesha. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. All right, let me get this screen share set up. It's nice to see some of these people. Some of the names that are coming up right now are very impressive. Okay, so let me know if anything's going wrong. I'm gonna hide my video so I'm not looking at myself at least. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Ayesha Fuentes, as introduced, and I'm an objects conservator. And at the moment, I'm 1 year into a 3-year post here at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. I started in September of last year. I meant to go in September of 2024. And during this time, I'll mostly be working with the team responsible for moving the over 300,000 objects in storage here at MAA from one offsite facility to another, from one storage facility to another. This process involves photographing everything and updating records, and where possible, building evidence for provenance and collection history. All of this information is being added live, by the way, to the MAA online collections portal. This is an essential effort, I feel, in terms of the institution's responsibility and transparency. And as part of this team, it is my role as a researcher and conservator to establish a standard of care for these materials, to document their condition, and where possible, to improve them. Further, my function is to develop this collection as a material and technical archive, and in so doing, challenge existing standards and methods for access, collections care, and museum practice. It's this work that I want to discuss today, and I want to share some of the material and ethical complexities that I navigate in doing my job in this setting. But I also really, more than anything, want to invite feedback from all of you that might help shape my efforts over the next 2 years. Okay, so I'm going to start with a simple case study and a simple question, which is, what do I do in a day? I spend a lot of time documenting materials and condition for this archaeology and anthropology collection, and when possible, improving its standard of care. In this setting, global collection of diverse technologies facilitated by British colonial networks in the 19th and 20th centuries. This often involves the cultivation of a technical language based on making distinctions between data, dirt, and damage. Here's a fairly straightforward example on the screen. This is a drum from East Africa with 2 spots of color on the plain surface, so that top surface there. They are white and red, and they seem to have been applied in a deliberate and coherent way. According to our records, the red is ochre and the white is snake excrement. There's also snake skin on the object. Red ochre is deliberately applied elsewhere in the material culture of this region, and the spots are coherent and seemingly deliberately applied. So in other work settings, I have removed soil and feces, but here, by reading the object and investigating its function and settings for use, I interpret these deposits as integral to the drum and as an indication of its social, cultural, and technical value. So I leave them where they are. Here's a more complex object. a leather apron given as a gift to a British collector in Nigeria in the 1970s. And just to note that today there's going to be a lot of African material, but that's mostly because that's what has been processed since I've been here. In a few years, I may be able to give the exact same talk using material from the Pacific or the Americas or the Arctic even. So in this particular object, you see cowrie shells, coins, and green plastic beads, which are attached to the front surface of the skin. The coins are particularly interesting, however. They were minted for British West Africa, which you could see possibly in the detail on the right there, between the years 1939 and 1952, with an inscription recognizing George VI as both king and emperor of the Indies. However, my challenge was to document and, if possible, improve the condition of this object without, at the same time, erasing anything that might be considered data insofar as it illustrates the object's use, valorization, historical materiality, or engineering by design. So first I needed to determine if the white deposits, and maybe you can see them in the photo on the left here, there's kind of a white, small white circles that are all over, far smaller than the cowrie shells, but there's this white debris or white deposit accretion that's on the surface of the leather. So faintly you can see them, and I first needed to determine if they were related to the function of the object, if they were hazardous, and then also if they demonstrate anything interesting about the life of the object at the museum. So I sampled some for posterity, which I did without any invasion of the actual historical material. I just sampled the deposit. And then did a series of tests to give me an idea of whether these white deposits are pesticide residues, salt from human or animal sweat, a deliberately applied material supplemental to use, such as the red ochre and the snake poo that we saw on the previous slide. Or are they the deterioration of a waxy or oily dressing applied to the leather in a museum setting? Based on my testing, I determined that it was likely the final option and therefore not informative, but rather a distraction and an indication of a poorly aged and inappropriate treatment. However, I also noticed that there was a fine red colorant on the surface of the apron. So I needed a method for cleaning, which I had determined to be dirt, a method for cleaning what I had determined to be dirt without removing what was potentially data, connecting this object to its originating geocultural context. So the solution was chemical, but also required selective cleaning. And in the end, I'm pleased with the results. And I have to admit that for conservators, surface cleaning just gives you this wonderful feeling of agency and accomplishment. But I think this is also a fairly clear resolution for the kinds of colonial legacies that I try to navigate at a material and technical level. However, dissociation, which is the decontextualization of material heritage resulting in the disruption of the narratives, values, and practices which activate it. This is a common agent of deterioration in this collection and one against which my skills are fairly limited. Here, for example, on the left, you have a tag found during object processing. This type of erasure is not rare, and we have whole boxes which are labeled world unprovenanced, for example. And in fact, the original MOVES project was estimated to be 250,000 objects, but that number has steadily increased to at least 300,000 in the first 2 years as the team responsible for this work regularly locate and establish documentation for materials previously thought missing or which were never given a record as part of a collection. So this is a growing collection as we go through it. This type of restitution is done by 9 collections assistants: Sam, Katrina, Annie, Louise, Eleanor, Jane, Lizzie, Emily, and Lily. I got to give them all shouts out because they're doing all the work. They are responsible for photographing the objects and updating their records by adding information about their provenance or identification, as well as correcting or contextualizing biased or ambiguous language in existing documentation and promoting, where possible, local terms and descriptions. As someone concerned with material care, I'm also interested in evidence for the traditions of repair, reuse, creative reactivation, and maintenance from which these items have been displaced, such as the method of mechanical stabilization for board containers using plant fiber and plating that you see on the right. It's this beautiful local repair. I often feel that conservation establishes its authority through a eurocentric or eurogenic argument for empirical learning, or through an assumption that other traditions of material care, those outside the museum context, for example, are not scientific in their methodologies, and I'll put scientific in scare quotes. As part of my research and practice, however, I've started studying the method of repair that you see here on the right, for example, in order to expand my own skill set. And I'm currently drying a gourd for work starting in the spring. So I'm really trying to engage with these practices of repair and learn what I can from them. Working with such a diversity of materials and technologies in this collection, I am often reminded of my limitations in my own training and experience, as well as the museum's position within a dynamic global tradition of preservation ethics. So for example, I was removing pest debris from this drum from Uganda, and as I do with many of the drums in the collection, I gave it a light thwunk on the playing surface to evaluate its sound. I'm not a drummer, but I nevertheless found that this is a very useful diagnostic tool for the object's condition. And besides, there are few things sadder to me than a silent musical instrument in a museum collection. This particular drum had a miserable flat sound, likely related to this light area of the drum head, which you can see to the bottom left, a patch made of a thick and rigid animal skin. This is a different species and preparation from the original, which is the rest of the drum head, with the possible addition of an adhesive putty around the patch edges. It was difficult to say at first when or by whom this was done. However, this historic repair was recontextualized when one of our collections assistants, who specializes in musical instruments, that's Eleanor Beeston Sheriff, musician herself, she did the research and found the image on the left, wherein a drum resembling this one had been photographed upside down, with the objects taken from it placed around the exterior. She moreover recognized the bundle at the bottom left of the historic photo as an object which she had processed a few months previously, seen in another historic photo on the right there. There had been no mention of this alteration in the object's record. It was rather by investigating the patch on the drumhead that we, and mostly Eleanor, was able to suggest an explanation for the condition of this drum at present. Also, we aren't certain yet that all of the items removed from the drum are still in the collection at MAA. Coincidentally, the museum is hosting a delegation of Ugandan heritage professionals this week, and we're meant to discuss this drum on Thursday. So I'm sorry I can't share the conversation with you right now. It's literally 2 days away, as well as several other options in the objects in the collection. If anyone is here interested, and I would really love to talk about it more, to discuss, how or if we should restore or reinterpret this object, provided we could actually reunite it with what has been removed from within it. So just to take a pause, I want to pause in the case studies. This image is not related to the collection at MAA necessarily, but I want to talk about the vocabularies that I'm using and how they reflect or respond to a legacy of colonial knowledge production or eurocentric knowledge production endemic to many areas of museum practice and to conservation in particular. So this image is pretty famous. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. But when Edward Colston's statue was removed from its plinth in Bristol, when this happened, I was teaching in a conservation postgraduate course here in the UK. And I showed this image to my students. I asked them how they would describe the condition of this object, meaning the statue, if it came to their bench, and specifically, I asked them if they would describe the alterations resulting from its deinstallation as damage or deterioration. Though none of them thought the word damage was appropriate, they nevertheless had to engage with their training and inherited knowledge systems to describe the object's condition as a result of changes to its social or cultural value, rather than an expectation about its material integrity or longevity as a public monument. This is related in part to some of the fundamental assumptions and shared narratives on which museum practice and conservation expertise are constructed at present. Here, for example, you have the section related to conservation from the International Council of Museums Code of Ethics. This is, I think, 2017. And I should note, actually, that this text is in the process of being revised with consultations ongoing. So if any of you are interested, definitely look that up through ICOM. But let's take a look at this particular definition. So just to read from the screen, The museum should carefully monitor the condition of collections to determine when an object or specimen may require conservation restoration work and the services of a qualified conservator or restorer. The principal goal should be the stabilization of the object or specimen, and I added that emphasis there. All conservation procedures should be documented and as reversible as possible, and all alterations should be clearly distinguishable from the original specimen or object. So you can see from this definition, there's an emphasis on stability as well as accountability and documentation. But what also strikes me working in a collection often conditioned by a time scale, which is not necessarily anthropocentric, is the expectation that the preservation of cultural materials requires the longevity of specific objects or properties. This model for conservation is much easier to achieve, for example, in a temperate climate with sealed buildings, or with highly refined and standardized material processes like fresco, cast metal, or stone sculpture. It is much harder to work to this standard when the materials are relatively fragile or less processed, or when their preservation has historically been achieved more often through maintenance, reconstruction, or renovation, and the direct transmission of skill and intergenerational knowledge, rather than the conservation of specific objects. It is therefore one of my priorities in this work to cultivate precise, consistent documentary language for describing materials, techniques, and conditions that is specific to this context, as well as these collections. Many of the issues I encounter here can be attributed to what is called benign neglect, or an insufficient investment in identifying and solving problems arising. So for example, this basket for keeping pigeons has slumped over time due to the gradual destabilization of unrefined plant materials and insufficient support in storage. But really, what was the intended timescale for the use, maintenance, reconstruction, or disposal of this object? And what was the expectation of the collector relative to the lifetime of these materials? I find myself thinking about this quite a bit at work. How can I practice conservation, documenting condition, and encouraging access in a way that engages with the variety of temporalities evident in these collections? At the same time, how can I establish a standard of care for these objects, which acknowledges their materiality and moreover encourages accountability and transparency on behalf of the institution? Finally, how can I make these materials accessible to a greater diversity of expertise so that they might function as a platform to preserve skill and embodied knowledge? Here's a dramatic example of one of the most pervasive condition problems that we have in anthropology, as well as natural history collections, pesticide residues. And this is going to be a major challenge to all of those problems that I just posed in the previous slide. Here's a sword from East Africa with a leather scabbard to which a pesticide was applied at some point in its history. On the left, you have the sword in its previous storage container, and on the right, you can see where my hand in a glove has disturbed the residue and left an impression of my fingers in the pesticide residue. This last image was really helpful for getting the attention of chemical safety when I needed their support. This one, on the other hand, this is an image that I circulated to promote this talk. This is a mask with a wooden textile, it's got wooden, textile, and bone elements, also from Nigeria. This is another example of pesticide application. Though there is evidence this object has been previously used or worn, it has been at MAA for over 100 years, and at some point in its life as part of the collection, it appears and smells very strongly as though a pesticide had been applied as a powder. Likely naphthalene or paradichlorobenzene, both compounds used in mothballs. Conservators and collections care professionals know that these chemicals, including as well arsenic, methyl bromide, and DDT, have been applied in museums historically through MAA. Though MAA, like most institutions I've seen, doesn't always have a record of when this happened or what was used. So I'm really kind of flying blind whenever I come across one of these suspected pesticide residues. And also just to note that in recent decades, certainly now, we don't apply pesticides. Instead, we prefer to treat with heat, with cold, or with depriving the object of oxygen, or really the insects of oxygen in a closed environment. Identifying these residues, however, on historic objects and developing a safe handling practice is key to the health and security of museum staff, but this is also a major challenge to access and even to repatriation. A large part of my work at MAA involves documenting hazards like these and cultivating a risk management strategy, as well as, where possible, diminishing or mitigating the residues. So just to go back to vocabulary, then what then is damage in this particular context? Jonathan Ashley Smith was a conservation scientist at the Victoria and Albert Museum, so different type of collection. But he worked at the V&A in London for about 25 years, and he wrote this definition in 1999. So he wrote, damage is usually associated with a loss of material, a loss of well-being, or a loss of expectation. Not everything people consider as damage results in a change of value. Not every change in physical or chemical properties results in loss. The relationships between state, value, and use are examined in an attempt to arrive at definitions of damage. The most useful definition is related to changes in utility. So here we're looking at the relationship between value, utility, and the integrity of the object and its capacity for physical or chemical change. However, thinking back to some of the examples I've been sharing and how they might relate to this definition, I have to ask again, how do I articulate or preserve the utility of something in an archaeology and anthropology collection without a known context? Or something which cannot be safely handled or reactivated? I'm asking these questions here today because I know that I can't answer them alone. So definitely one of the reasons that I was so glad to be able to share this work with this group. So one final example of damage and documentation to consider. Here are 3 figures taken from a Konso grave marker in Ethiopia in the early 20th century, mounted onto a wooden pedestal and stored within the museum collection for a century. As you might be able to see from the detail on the left, these figures have been labeled directly in pencil on the forehead. So they have labels that have been applied directly to the object. When I first saw this, I thought it indicated a poor standard of care and I wanted to remove it. However, in talking through it with the rest of the Stores Move team, it was suggested that this writing should be preserved for purposes of transparency and as an illustration of the often deleterious effects of colonial knowledge production. This, to me, is damage. These are objects in poor or poorer condition as an unintended result of historic museum practice. And while chemical pesticides, for example, have arguably contributed to the longevity of these materials, they can also be interpreted as detrimental to their long-term social value. Within my role, and even at this talk today, I wanted to address the responsibility of the institution here. Who is responsible for improving the condition of these cultural materials? How do we as museum communicate about this kind of deterioration and its associated risks? And that's another thing that I'm really looking at, is how do I actually talk about these forms of damage in a way that invites a collaborative response. So I've mentioned access a few times in this talk, but let me be clear about what this means to me. Visual, informational, and even physical access to material heritage held in museum collections. Personally, I would love to know what a museum could be if this, rather than exhibitions, loans, and related publications, were the operational priority. For the past 6 months, I've been circulating a survey about access restrictions in museums, their reasoning and practice, and how they are communicated to people making requests. And I can drop a link to the survey in the chat at the end if people are interested. It's only 5 questions long and completely anonymous. So far, I found that the primary challenge for institutions is insufficient time, space, and staff resources, as well as a lack of clarity on behalf of the institution communicating its policies and procedures for access. Within this, I have been particularly interested to see how or if conservation contributes to institutional gatekeeping practices. And if anyone, so I can drop the survey in the chat at the end of this. If any of you have experienced any restrictions to access or actually experienced being told no when you were trying to access a collection. Initially, I was concerned that material integrity or stability, as suggested by the ICOM Code of Ethics shown earlier, was an inappropriate standard by which requests for access should be evaluated. However, I recently found myself in the position of restricting access to a researcher, which was also very informative and surprising. In this case, however, there were 2 clubs from the Caribbean region of the Americas, which a researcher wanted to sample for carbon dating and to determine the species of the wood used. Though the researcher's work is substantial and the proposal was robust, I was not convinced that invasive destructive sampling on these otherwise coherent, well-preserved objects was essential to their research aims, and instead suggested techniques for non-invasive microscopy and digital imaging. I refused to do the proposed sampling and strongly argued against it. The researcher has since very graciously withdrawn their proposal. My concern here was facilitating access to the objects and the information they contain, but at the same time, finding a compromise between the study of material culture and the long-term well-being of these wooden clubs and preserving their potential connection to a community of origin. Again, I'm happy to answer questions about this exchange here or elsewhere. Finally, just to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about how this collection reflects the extractive, often colonial processes suggested by this detail of a map of French West Africa on the left here, with its various arrows and taxonomies of beasts and plants and minerals being extracted from Africa and heading towards Europe. On the other hand, you have arrows coming in with flight patterns for people coming to other French colonial holdings. I often engage with this idea of extraction through the ways in which this collection functions as an ecological archive. I frequently work with animal ivories, skins, fur, and feathers from species which are threatened, endangered, or even extinct in their historic habitats. For any of you who've seen the recent exhibition on color at MAA, for example, you've noticed a large feathered cloak from Hawaii made with the feathers of a bird which was extinguished in the last century as a result of overhunting and habitat encroachment. The leopard skin on the right in the slide here was collected before 1910 in Nigeria, where leopards are now listed as a species vulnerable to extinction. While completing my condition assessment of this object, I made a note of the state of the species within the region of origin at the same place in the database where I described damage due to insect activity and the presence of suspected pesticide residues. This was an experiment, but I felt it was necessary. I've had people ask me about the most expensive thing I've ever worked on or the oldest, but few ask me about the most valuable or the most fragile. These derivatives of threatened species are, to me, the most demanding objects and the materials in which I am most invested in terms of their highly specialized utility. One of my projects in collaboration with the Leather Conservation Center in Northampton is to take hair examples from different species in order to develop an archive. But if you have any other ideas about how this collection might be developed or engaged in this way as the archive of an environment or an ecological relationship even, please do let me know. Okay, so I want to end with something. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open this up in a second, but I want to end with something that I've done a few times now. I've asked this question to a few different rooms, and I feel like this was going to be, I hope this is a good room to ask this question in. This question comes from watching every episode of Secret Life of the Zoo during the pandemic lockdown. I started to think about the relationship between what a conservationist does, like a wildlife conservationist, and what I do as a collections care and conservation professional. So I came up with this particular question, which I would like to pose to all of you, and maybe if you just want to answer in the chat or just have a think about it. Which of these wildlife conservation models most resembles current museum practice? So you've got Noah's Ark, the zoo, natural history collection, so taxidermy specimens, think museum of zoology, protected ecosystem like a nature reserve or a national park, or are we engaged in nomadic pastoralism? And I'm just going to stop there and let you guys think about that.